Welcome. Today we are going to discuss the moral case for liberty. As we know, campuses across the country are becoming even more hostile towards conservative and libertarian ideas. How can we make the positive case for liberty? And what are the best ways to talk about individual liberty, limited government, and free enterprise? Today, we're joined by Christina Sandefur, the Executive Vice President of the Goldwater Institute, a think tank based in Arizona. Christina develops policies and litigates cases advancing healthcare freedom, free enterprise, private property rights, free speech, and taxpayer rights. Today, we hope that you learn practical ways to talk about how these timeless principles result in more opportunity and prosperity for all Americans. And we also hope that you leave the session ready to get more of your peers thinking about other points of view. Christina, we are so excited that you are here today. Let's go ahead and dive in. First, how do we make the moral case for freedom?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. And, it's an excellent question. As you mentioned, coast to coast, conservative and libertarian speech is being stifled at universities. Frankly, I think politics is even worse. Politics is more and more lacking in logic and civility, and so it's more important than ever to make the moral case for freedom. But I think our side has sometimes failed to do that effectively. If we want to make the moral case for freedom, in my opinion, we really need a different and fresh approach. We can't stifle debate. We can't shrink from debate, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. But we also can't really get rid of civility. We can't dehumanize those that we disagree with. I think we see a lot of that going on. We can't do that. And really, at the end of the day, we can't forget that even though this issue is so important to us, protecting freedom is so important to us, we have to convince people why it should be important to them. Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care, as the saying goes. So we really have to be, paragons of integrity and intellectual, and we also represent of compassion. And I think we do that by really looking at ourselves as leaders. Everybody in the movement is a leader and an ambassador for freedom, regardless of whether you're an intern or you're a staffer or whether you're at the top of an organization. It really doesn't matter. And so I think once everybody puts themselves in that position, then the way to make the moral case for freedom is to remember what I call the 4 Ps. And those 4 Ps are principles, precision, politeness, and people.
Excellent. I love that. So principles, precision, politeness, and people. Can you walk me through the first P, principles? It's always a good idea to ask why before we ask how. So why do we make the case for freedom?
Yeah, so principles, why do we make the case for freedom? Well, ultimately freedom truly is mankind's most precious gift. It is essential for human flourishing. It is what makes us human and it's what makes our lives worth living. The right to live our lives and pursue our own happiness as we, for our needs, actually, is what makes life more than mere existence. And so that's why freedom is so important. It's important to earn a living for your family. It's important to express yourself, but it's also important for the soul. We fight for freedom as a movement to empower people to live freer, happier lives. And I think, when we do that, we have to focus on policies and on principles, not on people and on politics. That's why we make the moral case for freedom, because politicians come and go, and often they fall short of our expectations. How many times have you voted for somebody, whether it be at the local level or for president, and you think, gosh, this person is really speaking my language. They're really gonna bring important change and protect my rights. And then, of course, they become a typical politician and they succumb to the system. We can't rely on politicians and politics. We have to be unwavering voices for liberty, regardless of which party is out there, because ultimately we are the protectors of freedom because it is important to human flourishing.
Absolutely. So the next thing you mentioned was precision. So why is it important to be precise when we make the case for freedom?
Yeah, words matter. And it's interesting today, what used to be expressed in essays and in newspapers and magazines is sometimes now narrowed down to, 140 characters on Twitter or very short posts on Facebook. And we live in an age where increasingly we can get information very quickly. And headlines, especially sexy headlines that lure people in, are dominating the conversation. Those aren't necessarily bad things. It's good that we can get information quickly. But I think the problem is that we're forgetting that precision, that the words that we use, the words that we choose, is extremely important, and it conveys an idea and it conveys our intentions. So it's important to think about the words that we use. So a couple examples. I hear a lot of people in the libertarian and conservative movement use the term states' rights. I think a lot of them are well-intentioned when they use it. They're talking about, the fact that our founding fathers created the states, separate governments, to push back against federal overreach when the federal government goes too far and to protect our rights. But unfortunately, if you think about the words themselves, states' rights, well, that means that the state itself, the government, has those rights. And no, that's not true. People have rights. States have powers. So we can talk about states using their power to push back against federal overreach, but ultimately the people have rights. And it might seem a little semantic distinction, but it's extremely important because it conveys an idea. We should never forget that people are the ones that have rights. Governments have limited powers. Another example that I hear a lot is crony capitalism, right? Our side talks a lot about crony capitalism because, we're talking about the fact that businesses sometimes get special favors from government, and typically that's big businesses. That's where government comes in and picks winners and losers. There are certain businesses that that's absolutely wrong, and we should push back against that. But that's not a form of capitalism at all, right? Cronyism is when government gives special favors to businesses. Capitalism is a system where fairness is upheld, where the rule of law is upheld, where you compete for buyers and by producing good services and products, and everything is fair and protected by the rule of law. Cronyism is the opposite of that. So again, when we say crony capitalism, we're sort of insinuating that there's, a sort of a bad side of capitalism, when in fact cronyism isn't capitalism at all. Those are just a couple of examples, that come to the top of my head. But again, it's really important, especially when you're writing a message on Twitter or using a space where you only get a couple of words. It's really important to use those words effectively and wisely and to say exactly what it is that we mean.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for sharing those examples as well. So next up is something that seems to be glaringly absent from many of today's political conversations, and that is politeness. So how does the way that we communicate freedom affect our ability to get the message across?
Yeah, today it was relevant yesterday, it will be relevant tomorrow. Unfortunately, there is an increasing desire to yell and scream and hold a tantrum in order to be heard. And look, I don't want to discount why people do that. I think some people feel that they're not heard or that they're not understood, and so they feel like the only way to be heard is to scream. But and I don't just mean that literally, but I mean that by analogy as well, that people feel like they have to get heated, they have to get emotional, they have to get political in order to be heard. But unfortunately, that denigrates the conversation and it makes it just noise. I think it's very hard to do. We all fail sometimes. Even myself, I do as well. But I think you need to take a step back, take a deep breath, and we just need to think about acting with people that might think differently than us, in a very polite way, in a way where we assume the best of intentions, because the truth is that most people, not everyone, but most people do have the best of intentions, and we should give them that. So we need to discuss things calmly and rationally. Our ideas might seem obvious to us. Advocating for freedom might seem obvious, but these ideas seem radical to a lot of people, and it's important to remember that our country is really the first country in the history of the world that was founded on these ideas, that was founded on the ideas that people have rights that come before government, and governments are there to protect those rights. So this is still a very radical notion. The idea that you have the right to make life or death decisions for yourself, that you have the right to decide whether you want to try medical treatment before begging the government for permission to do so. The idea that states can step in and protect the rights of individuals, the government fails to protect those rights. The idea that you have the right to earn an honest living free from unreasonable government interference, or that government has no business telling parents how to best educate their kids, but that school choice is important. Property rights, right? The idea that my home is my castle and I should be able to use my property as I see fit so long as I'm not harming someone else. On and on. These are paragons of freedom. These are things that we almost take for granted that they should be true, but not everybody sees things that way. And so again, we have to recognize that these ideas are radical to some people, that they haven't been introduced to them. And we have to then, avoid personal attacks, avoid going out of your way to alienate people. Start from the presumption, again, that people mean well, but that they're not familiar with ideas, or they don't, and you need to persuade them. So, no personal attacks, no ad hominems. Another thing I think that's really important, we deal a lot with politicians that make anti-freedom decisions. There are always some exceptions to this, but my general rule of thumb is name the office, not the person. So if the governor does something bad, say the governor did such and such, and that violates freedom for this reason, you don't need to use the governor's particular name. Again, sometimes you might, but generally, it's government, right? It's not about a particular individual. It doesn't really matter what person is making that decision. We're not running for office, and we're not talking about political opponents. We're talking about the idea is bad. The thing that they did was bad. Let's focus on that. Don't ascribe motives. Again, there's always exceptions to this, but typically, we don't know why people do what they do. And I think a lot of Democrats have this mentality that, the bureaucracy knows best, government knows best, government needs to come in there and protect you from yourself. And that may be abhorrent to most of us. But I think it does come very misinformed but well-intentioned of times. And even if it doesn't, it really doesn't matter, because again, we're not talking about the motives. You could have motives or the worst of motives. At the end of the day, we're talking about the fact that the idea is bad and it stifles freedom. So let's focus on that. Also, don't use terms like left or right. And again, to this, but let's not talk always about Republicans left or right. Let's just talk about liberty, because both sides of the political aisle that care about freedom, and there are people on both sides of the political aisle that would stifle freedom. So let's talk about something we can rally together over, and not be if we don't need to be. At the end of the day, I think it's important, as I said, go back to being an ambassador for freedom. Example for the people who are watching. You might be fighting on Twitter with a political adversary, and it may get really heated. Keep in mind that you're not just talking to that person, you're talking to everybody else that might be looking at your feed. Set a good example. Think about, somebody, what you're talking about is somebody doesn't have sort of a preordained idea of where they stand on an issue. What do you want them to see you as? Do you want to be a representative of the freedom movement, firm in her convictions, but also, fair and responsible and polite? Or do you want to be somebody who throws a tantrum?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And really a lot within there that is so important to keep in mind. So finally, you mentioned people. So the power of humanizing our work and telling stories about how freedom is essential to everyday life. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, this goes back to, explain to people what freedom means to them and why they should care. When you're looking to tell these stories, I think it's really important to find people who are affected by government overreach, and then to explain again how freedom can help them or has helped them. Make it really simple and just go back. How does it affect me? Make it relevant to your audience. One of my favorite issues that I've ever had the privilege to work on is right to try. This is something that we not only crafted at the Goldwater Institute and worked on here, but we have literally worked with freedom partners in the State Policy Network all across the country to make right to try a reality in 41 states, and then of course signed into law in the federal government. We did that by telling stories. So what is right to try? Well, if we wanted to do the cut and dry policy issue, we would say, well, right to try is a law, a state law that became a federal law that protects terminally ill patients' right to try investigational treatments that have been prescribed by their doctors but haven't been fully approved by the FDA. That's compelling to people who believe in freedom, and that is what the issue is. But does that really get into the hearts and minds of people? Does that explain why it's so important? No. So then we dig a little deeper, right? So then we might say, okay, the United States approval process is broken. Americans are literally blocked by their government from life-saving medicines and treatments. They have to get a permission slip from the FDA in order to be able to save their lives, and that permission slip can take years. And in the meantime, patients suffer in limbo. Okay, that's getting a little bit more into the human side of it. But still, how does that affect an individual? So then we can dive a little deeper and tell a story. There's so many important stories to tell with Right to Try, but one of my favorites, because it shows the horrors of the system that we've set up, again, well-intentioned, is this one. I mean, there is a woman named Jen McNary. She has two boys, Austin and Max. They were basically babies when they were diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. That's an incurable disease. It's fatal. It is a degenerative muscle disorder. And by the time that Jen learned that her sons had Duchenne, there was promising treatment that was out there that was undergoing a clinical trial evaluation by the FDA. And so Jen wanted to get her boys into that clinical trial. Unfortunately, clinical trials are extremely limited. And Austin, her older son, had declined so badly that he was restricted to a wheelchair most of the time. And the clinical trial was only for boys who were still able to walk. They were testing the effectiveness of the drug on people who were still able to walk. And so that meant that Max, the younger son, was eligible, but Austin was not. So Jen McNary was forced to watch as one son was admitted to put on this treatment and improve significantly. I mean, he could go run outside with his friends. He was getting better. And her older son was getting worse to the point where he could no longer feed or dress himself. And her younger son was helping her older son with basic everyday life tasks. So, essentially 13-year-old Max became 16-year-old Austin's caregiver. That is the cruel reality of an arbitrary government system that picks, just based on some arbitrary line drawing, who gets to get a life-saving treatment and who doesn't. And that's what Right to Try aims to fix. So again, kind of walk through that, you can see how if we start from the issue, it's important when we explain why freedom, what it means to people when it's literally sometimes a life or death issue, what it means to families. I think that really makes a compelling case. And you should really be striving to do that on every issue that you work on. Some issues are easier to do that than others. Some issues seem very wonky or very scholarly. But at the end of the day, there's always a human story attached to it, and we should be striving to tell those as often as we can.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing such a compelling story about that really important policy. So to close out, where can we learn more about telling stories and making the case for liberty?
Yeah, well, at my organization, the Goldwater Institute, we have a blog called indefenseofliberty.blog. And if you go there, see that just about every day we tell these stories and we explain why principles of freedom are bettering people's lives every day. But of course, Goldwater is only one of many organizations that is a member of the State Policy Network. And I really encourage people to go to the other SPN members' sites, websites, social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and seek out these stories. I mentioned at the beginning that the freedom movement has sort of failed to be able to effectively make the moral case for liberty. I think we still have a long way to go, but I actually think we're doing much better than we used to. And a lot of our sister organizations are just really doing a fantastic job of telling these stories and doing so in a very compassionate way. So I encourage you to visit those websites, to seek out those stories, and just, never stop thinking again about the human aspect of making the case for freedom.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.